I don't know if you know Kim Klein. She's an American blogger. She writes very wise things. And she says some of the reigning wisdom about what organizations need may not be true. And I think there's a real germ of realization in this. Specifically, we may miss when we focus on strategies, plans, training, and evaluation. What we should be focusing on are ways to change our organization's structure, their habits, and their fundraising ethos. And I think there's a lot of truth in this. So, a light bulb moment is how we learn from our donors. This, I think, is solid gold, and it comes from a major donor in the United States called Paul Shervis. And I'm quoting it from CDE Project 9, which is the project for major donors. It says, "We have to replace the accepted wisdom here. It's not that charities need donors in order to help them achieve their organizational mission. That's not why charities need donors. We should replace that by an understanding that donors choose to support charities in order to achieve their personal ambitions, their personal missions." This is what we call the 90-degree shift, where we start looking at things not through our perspective or the perspective of our finance director or chief executive, but through the eyes of your donor. And when you start doing that, you start producing communications which are not about what you want to say, they're about what other people might want to read. That changes fundamentally the nature of your communication. So, time for a revolution. But who is the enemy? So, this is a photograph from the Institute of Fundraising's National Convention. I know a few of you were there. From a session called Meet the Donors, and I was chairing this session, and it turned out to be much more difficult than I thought. We invited a number of donors to come along. It just so happened that our panel was not very gender balanced, and all the panel were female, and so I was trying vainly to represent my particular grouping. But these were donors, and this was the first time that the Institute of Fundraising, in its 35-year history, had actually mounted an event like this. And it was very well attended, and it was very well evaluated. Now, I wrote afterwards about some of the things that the donors said. This is their speaking, not me. So this is listening to donors in a context where the donors were rather terrified because they felt they were going into this lion's den where all these fundraisers were arrayed against them. But they were bold and they were articulate and they were really quite fun. But they said some things that fundraisers had to sit up and pay attention to. No pressure ever. I wouldn't like my granny to be pressurized. Granddads too. I want to make a real difference. Tell me about the difference that I'm making. Did my gift get through? Now, again, I would say most fundraisers worth their salt would know this, but it was very refreshing to hear it coming unsolicited from the donors' mouths themselves. Feedback. I'm going to talk more about feedback because it's something we do badly and we could do much better. But they want feedback to know what their support has achieved. Integrity I've talked about, respect, listen to what we think and what we want, send less but better, only send intelligent communications. An awful feeling that people were getting things that didn't speak to them. Know me and show me that you know me. Very good direct marketing basics. None of them liked things like premiums and gimmicks and gifts and things like that. They really didn't like that at all, even though they worked, perhaps, but they didn't like that. They all accepted that emotion was part of the reason that they had become charity supporters, that their connection with the causes they believed in that had got them to this event was emotional, but they were quite hesitant about how we used emotion. Transparency, accountability, again, rather expectable, admin and salaries and so on. But really quite good stuff. Sorry, do you want, I will send you these. I promise you can have this. Just go to my blog, it's all there free. There's lots more, lots more. This is just edited highlights. Sorry. Have you got all that? Happy for me to move on? Don't try and write down this next slide. We were wrapping up after the event, and people had been coming up constantly saying that was great, we really loved that session. And then the volunteers who stand at the back and make sure that everything at the room monitors came and said, you know, we had about 5 people who came in and then went out again when they saw what your subject was. And they said, one of them said, I don't want to be told what to think and do by donors. And the 5 people left. Now, you'd think that's horrific. How could that be? Well, these are the evaluations. Great to hear from donors, interesting, best session, and all the lovely stuff that we fearful, timid speakers love to hear. The donor panel was excellent, good to hear from real donors. Daphne, who was one of them, was amazing. More time. More like this, wonderful insight. Then there's always a Mr. Grumpy effect. Microphone volumes weren't very good. But this one, it'll be Ken's shirt was too dazzling. But then, whoa, best session so far. It went on like that. So most of the comments were really positive. But then, so disappointed. Discussion was focused on all the bad publicity, big story items, and what we did wrong. I expected better and wanted more from Ken. I was just the interviewer. I didn't have any opinions worth reiterating. We were here to listen to donors. So, I mean, I love whoever wrote this comment because they wanted more from me. But I think if they'd had more from me, I would have been way more critical than the donors were, much more critical than the donors were. But then it went on. This is a different comment. I found the discussion too general. Why should I listen to 5 opinions? Should we stop doing this because 5 people said we should? Well, if 100% of your donors were saying we should stop doing this, maybe we should stop doing this. But at least we should listen to what they're saying and see if we can do something about it. The ideas that they had were also things that all charities strive to do anyway. It felt like a wasted opportunity. And a similar comment. I found this session frustrating. It portrayed fundraisers in a negative light. Where was the proud fundraisers? This is our career. It seemed like a moan session. Asking probing questions like, do fundraisers show respect to donors, to be met with no is unjust. Sadly, very disappointing. Now, I mean, there's always a spread of opinion, as we've seen ourselves. But I do think there's a need for our sector, or for many in our sector, to step back and try and see things through their donors' eyes. And they may just see things a bit differently. That doesn't mean that there was nothing that came out of that session that said you can't do this or you shouldn't do that. But there was really useful insights. And I do think most of the people who went to that session found it valuable and learned from it and will make some adjustments, small or large. But there are obviously some who got nothing from it. So I think we need to recognize that. I don't think it's necessarily unhealthy, but I do think we need to recognize that. So moving on to the enemy, all revolutions require something to overthrow. They all require an enemy. So is the enemy, if you were to meet the enemy, is it the media? I certainly don't think they've been our friends. Is it this guy? This is Sir Stuart Etherington, who chaired the government's commissioned Etherington Review. Is he our enemy, the regulator? Is it the government themselves that are the enemy? Or is it these people, the board of trustees, all male, or the senior management team that at least has one? Sorry, I'm talking about Britain here. We are not gender balanced in our charity boards, given the fact that 70% of the people who work in the charities are female. That hasn't yet percolated through to the organization's top layers. But it is changing, and it is getting better. It's a lot better than it was when I started out. Or is our enemy these people, the donors who power our causes? Or could it be someone else? I posed some of these questions in 1992, the bad old days. That's me on the left. Let's focus on doing what's right for the donor. And people bought my book, but what they were really thinking is, you're obviously a deranged lunatic. Because nothing changed. But I think we now have met the enemy, and he is us. The enemy is how so many of us do things for donors in ways that donors don't like. And that's a hard thing to digest. The biggest enemy is this notion. The way to raise more money is to ask more people for more cash, more often, and more vigorously. And I have to say that's the paradigm that was applying in 2015 in the UK. That was the paradigm. It may have been nuanced differently in different organizations, but that was the paradigm. I think what really contributes to that is some of the things I've mentioned before: short-term thinking, target-led mentality, the fact that we each year have to raise more and more money, the fact that our organizations tend to run a mile when the I word is mentioned, investment, that we don't like taking risks, and all commercial enterprises have to take risks to some extent, that there is a kind of copycat culture that bases itself on precedent, laziness, decline in testing, and people don't test fundraising in the way that they did when I was a young fundraiser. People work in silos. I think sometimes we've not been very clear about the kind of people that make the best fundraisers, and we're not clear about the kind of training that we give them. Lack of concern, taking donors for granted, and the fact that there's simply too much stuff. I do want to spend most of the rest of today focusing on the positives of how we change this. But I think there are a number of things that we have at our disposal that will help us turn the tide. One is that we have to be really, really nice. Doing business with us should be a really great experience. We should be the nicest people to do business with. I'm not sure we often enough are. I've mentioned integrity, open transparency and honesty, controlled egos, no tricks, no subversiveness, no gimmicks. I think we need to be very straight and open and honest. We have, I believe, the best stories in the world to tell. Stories of human drama and life and what matters and how to make a difference. We have the best stories in the world to tell, and we've got the best of reasons for telling them well. And we need to tell them with power and passion that will move people to action. Those are the skills that fundraisers need to be focusing on, not fundraising from behind a spreadsheet. Reciprocity, I've mentioned, great products and propositions. Some of the most successful organizations have been very clearly good at developing that. Much better evidence of the difference donors make. I want to talk about being famous for frequent, fast, fabulous feedback, giving donors choices, positive opt-out, and always giving more than is expected. And finally, invest boldly, wisely, and sufficiently. As I say, people run a mile when they are confronted with that requirement. I don't think we will see the change that needs to be in fundraising unless our organizations invest more in the customer experience, the donor experience.